Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video we're going to be discussing PC gaming. Most specifically, how developers, in my opinion, are much more likely to better support PC gaming in the future. And this is all thanks to the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. So, in case you're not that familiar, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 had a very different architecture to that of the PC. One of them, of course, was because it was using, well, effectively derivatives of the PowerPC architecture. This meant that consequently, also because of the RAM restrictions in the systems, that, well, it often was a lot more difficult to then port the game to the PC. That meant that the PC often wasn't the leading platform. You can actually tell this by games like, say, Dark Souls on the PC. Despite the fact that I think it's a very good game, the PC port was somewhat lackluster, specifically on low-resolution textures and so on used throughout, as well as PC-specific issues such as occasional crash. The reason behind this was the developers simply said, look, we tried our best, but we're not that familiar with the game, and you could argue that they could have got someone else to port it. The problem is that costs more money. And the game did end up selling pretty damn well on PC, and that's one of the reasons that they're going to bring the next Dark Souls to the PC first and foremost. But I imagine one of the real benefits for them, one of the things that's becoming a lot more attractive to developers now, is that PC gaming sales are remaining fairly strong. Low-end desktop sales are, well, becoming worse, but that's to be expected. But the actual PC sales for gaming are remaining pretty consistent, especially in America and certain parts of Europe, which is very good news, because obviously America is a pretty huge market. So because of that, and because of the ability for developers to say, look, developing for the PC is actually a benefit, and I'll go into why in just a moment, that's only a good thing for PCs, and that's one of the reasons I'm actually really happy about the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, other than the fact that they look pretty damn cool as well. So let's talk about the development side of things for a moment. It's unsurprising to regular viewers, or for those of you who know anything about the systems, that they are using the AMD Jaguar, which is an x86/64 processor. Now, this is very important because that does mean that the games are going to be using 8 gigs of RAM. Well, technically not, because obviously there is some memory going towards operating system, but on the case of the PS4, it's likely to be about 7 gigs available for games, which is pretty good. It also demonstrates that for us PC folk, we're most likely going to really want to see 64-bit processor minimum. And indeed, there have already been comments from several developers who have said, look, in just a couple of years, 32-bit games aren't really going to be around. One of the problems with 32-bit is simple. It cannot address more than 4 gigs of memory. And that's obviously, well, bupkis now, because we're starting to get textures and so on for graphics that are becoming far larger. Fortunately, most modern PCs do actually have a 64-bit processor minimum. And I say most modern, I think just about any modern processor now is 64-bit. Now, there are still the occasional 32-bit operating systems lurking around, specifically, say, Windows 7, but honestly, it's not that difficult to change anymore. PC development really comes down to OpenGL or DirectX. DirectX 3D is, well, one of the big ones, and obviously it is from Microsoft. That means that it has a lot of crossover with the Xbox. DX11 specifically also has a lot of similarities towards the PlayStation's own programming language, and indeed the wrapper API on the PlayStation 4 is also very similar. There are some discrepancies, of course, but it's still very similar to that of DirectX. That's very good for, well, the PlayStation, because that means that indie developers will be very, 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 very fortunate, and they'll be able to just hit the ground running. But it also means that for PC development, the PC can become a lot more of a leading platform. You can actually tell this by developers such as Ubisoft Reflections. Now, they are creating a title known as The Crew. And they've actually specified and stated that PC hardware is going to be the lead platform, and they're actually using it as a base. I'm going to read you guys a couple of quotes. We started off with a large code base. There were about 12,000 source files, and we started with a 64-bit version of Windows of the engine using DX11. It's important to start with a 64-bit version because obviously the PS4 hardware is 64-bit, so it's nice to have these 32-bit, 64-bit issues out of the way before you start worrying about platform specifics. Our initial aim was to get the PS4 version to feature parity with the Windows version. Another quote, the crew uses a subset of the DX11 feature set, so that subset is for the most part easily ported to the PS4 API, but the PS4 is a console, not a PC. So a lot of things that are done by D3D on a PC, you just have to do yourself. It means there's more DIY to do so, but it gives you a hell of a lot more control over what you do with this system. And let's also talk about the programming language. So DX11 uses HLSL, whereas the PlayStation uses PSSL. So I'll say that again, DX11 HLSL, and for the PlayStation that would be PSSL. And there are subtle differences in the code, of course, but they share so many similarities that programmers are going to quickly become familiar with both. Indeed, The Crew was ported to the PS4 very quickly, and the game's actually slated for first quarter of next year, so Q1 2014. And this port was basically accomplished in 6 months with a team of just 2 to 3 people working on it. So overall, they believe the process of porting from the PC to the PS4 is going to be extremely easy, extremely straightforward. And other developers have specified pretty much exactly the same thing. They've said that, look, this is going to be easy, there's not going to be that much difficulty. So basically, a lot of titles, a lot of studios now are starting to have this same philosophy, where the next-gen multi-platform titles on the Xbox and the PlayStation, the PC took the point because it's the common, it's the common denominator. It shares the link between the Xbox and the PlayStation. Therefore, you get the PC version working well. Then you could simply, change what you need to make the PS4 version run well, or the Xbox version run well. Now, obviously, before anyone says so, there are definitely discrepancies between the PlayStation and, say, a console. One of those would be unified memory. Another one would be, of course, not dedicated hardware. But I think this is going to be a case, and maybe I'm wrong because obviously I cannot read the future. However, I think that we're going to start seeing a definite shift towards multi-CPU designs on the PC. I think that there are already a few instances where, say, 6 or 8 cores performs better in certain games at certain resolutions than, say, a more traditional tri- or 4-core CPU. And I think this is going to only become more and more and more commonplace. I think that we're going to get to a point where a processor for gaming is definitely going to want to be 6 cores plus. Now, we do know that the PS4 and the Xbox One have a certain amount of CPUs dedicated specifically for OS functionality, and that's fine and that's understood. We're not really sure what amount. Common knowledge and common sense would indicate that it's 2 processors, but as far as I'm aware, Sony haven't actually, or should I say 2 cores, but Sony haven't actually officially confirmed this exactly, and there have been murmurings from Microsoft on the same thing. So, from what we understand, I believe Microsoft have confirmed actually it's 2 CPU cores, but from Sony they've not really 100% confirmed it. There have been murmurs. As far as I understand it, I have looked. But let's assume that it is. That gives them 6 CPU cores to work with. Now obviously, the PC is not without operating system overheads. However, that can somewhat be offset by faster CPUs. We do know that the AMD Jaguar inside the PS4, the CPU portion is not as fast as modern desktop CPUs. That's just a given because it's a low power device. So we're going to have to see just how that works, but I think for gaming purposes, because these games would have been fabricated, created, and designed for use with multi-CPUs, which is very different to how games of, say, 2 or 3 years ago were created. Those games were often created with just a couple of threads in mind. Now, obviously, it's becoming less of a big deal now because, obviously, say, for example, Xbox 360 technically has a tri-core CPU which can handle 2 threads per core. However, generally that wasn't really facilitated when it came to the PC. There are a couple of instances where definitely quad-core CPUs do make a difference. Alan Wake, for example, performs definitely better on multi-CPU cores. That's not the only title. Crysis 3 definitely does perform better as well. And for earlier example, even GTA 4 performs a lot better. And indeed, many people were complaining when the title was released, talking GTA, that their dual-core processors or whatever simply wasn't up to the job because, well, the game was originally created with a huge amount of CPU usage in mind. It's very difficult to know what the future of PC hardware is going to be. It very much depends on who you're asking. AMD are pretty damn confident on the future of Fusion. In other words, the amalgamation of a GPU and CPU on the same die. It's not necessarily precluding the fact that a discrete GPU is still going to remain a part of the equation. So, for example, it will be located on a PCIe Express slot right there on your system. However, it is possible that we're going to see a lot more physics and AI and so forth being calculated on the GPU that's built into the Fusion die, if you will. Right now, PCIe 3 is available on PC. And despite the fact that, in theory, its bandwidth is pretty damn good, it's approaching that of internally of the link between the GPU and the CPU of the AMD Jaguar that's inside the PS4. It also does have to share that same bandwidth with also communicating with the memory and much more besides, which is very different to how the PS4 handles things. That's why Sony added in that extra bus. It also has another slight issue in regards to latency. However, right now, as things stand, we are not at a point where, well, bandwidth is really an issue for PCIe. And despite the fact that occasionally we are seeing slight improvements in frame rate, if you go with the really, really high-end cards, especially in, say, Crossfire or SLI, for example, 2 or 3 Titans in a row, often the frames per second are not that much difference. We're not looking at like 20% performance difference. Often it's a couple of percent. Why is that? Well, right now a lot of compute functionality is not being used. However, even in games where, well, physics is there, we're not seeing huge frame rate dips or anything like that. I'm going to give you guys an example. There's a website known as HardOCP, and they have a scaling of how PCIe 2 and PCIe 3 deal with, well, performance. Because obviously PCIe 2 has significantly less bandwidth than 3. As it turns out, there's not a huge difference at the rather insane resolution. This is a triple monitor setup, so that's 5760 by 1200, so that's significantly more than 1080p. It turns out that, I'm just going to give you guys the average frames per second. This is a triple GPU configuration of a GTX 680. And they have the following settings. DX11 features everything at max, that would be MVSS and HBAO. DirectX tessellation is maxed out at high. Detail level is set to max, which would be extreme. And finally, PhysX, which is NVIDIA's hardware physics application, is enabled to the highest setting, high. Now, on PCIe 2, you're looking at 57 frames per second, and on PCIe 3, you're looking at about 62. So that's about 5 frames per second difference, and this is an absolutely ridiculous amount of bandwidth that is being utilized. To put that into perspective, if there's only 2 GPUs being used at exactly the same resolution, the only difference being that PhysX is normal, but all the rest of the settings are maxed out, you're actually seeing absolutely no difference in frames per second between the two systems. So that tells you that PCIe 3, at least for the time being, isn't really got that much to worry about. However, that's for now. Who knows what's going to happen in 2 to 3 years' time? We do know, however, that next generation games from, well, on the PS4 and the Xbox One are going to have much bigger textures. And as I said, because the PC is going to be the lead development platform, we'll have to see if this trend continues. Regardless, one thing is absolutely for sure. PCs are going to have a very, very interesting few years ahead of them. So I think that's only going to continue. I think we're going to definitely start to move forward in that regard. I also think that for PC titles, we're going to start seeing an age where right now 1080p is 60 frames per second on most systems, on most games, doesn't really require more than 1.5 gigabytes of video memory. I think that's going to change. I think we're going to get to 2 gigs quite soon. I also think that it's probably going to balloon a lot more than that in a couple of years as well. Why? Because obviously texture resolution is going to go up significantly because of PC development, because of PS4 and Xbox One development. It's also going to be a lot easier for them just to say, you know what, we're just going to build it with the PC version in mind, with super high resolution textures, and then just downscale them according to the consoles, rather than build them for the consoles specifically and then just add high HD textures, which is often what happens for PC development. If you guys notice, a lot of the time there isn't, say, extra detail, it just looks a little bit sharper on certain ports, and obviously we do get the 60 frames per second, obviously we can put it in 1080p, but other than that, effectively we're playing pretty much exactly the same game, just with a slightly higher texture resolution. I imagine that this may change slightly on PC development, simply because the games can be altered a lot more to be tailored towards the specific platform. So obviously, since PC is going to become the lead platform, then they can simply tailor it towards say the PS4 and so on. I think that's going to be good news for overall performance and, well, visual fidelity of the PC titles as well. For PC gamers, we do have certain features and functions, of course, that are exclusive towards PC, such as, for example, triple monitor gaming and mods, which are going to, of course, be hopefully better supported in next generation games. And I actually lament the fact that certain games aren't better supported of mods. I actually think that Skyrim on PC is significantly better than console, not so much because of just the better textures, but actually because of the use of mods, which allows you to do very silly things. Sure, you could, if you wanted, to have a My Little Pony type of adventure if you wanted, but you can also do things such as virtually eliminating the lockpicking if you so wish, or adding a ton new spells, or even doing things such as getting entire new areas of the game for completely free. And Bethesda have helped support this with a very, very good workshop of tools. I mean, there's even been recent news of some guy putting 2,000 hours into modifying the game to create an absolutely huge area with masses of stuff to explore. And I think that's very cool. And I think that it's going to be a very, very, very interesting state of affairs if mods start to become bigger. Even Grand Theft Auto, for example, has been modded for the PC. And Grand Theft Auto on the PC allows you to even do things such as play as Iron Man. And that's very cool. I mean, I think that's pretty awesome, just being able to do this type of stuff. So, what other things would I like to see? Well, funnily enough, I think the shift to an x86-64 platform is going to fix a lot of stuff. Now, Microsoft originally did try the x86 platform, of course, with the original Xbox. And it was somewhat mixed success. It didn't do terribly, it actually did okay, but they realised it was a bit too expensive, it put out a bit too much heat, and so on and so forth, and that was one of the reasons that the system was so huge. To be fair to the original generation Xbox, it did have a decent amount of memory in it. but it also had some performance issues, most noticeably the cache and a couple of other bits and pieces. And so it wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a perfect system. In fact, arguably, pound for pound, the best console in that generation was probably the GameCube. And indeed, Nintendo somewhat milked it. I mean, they pretty much used an overclocked GameCube for the original Wii, and there was even some facets and similarities of the CPU design still present in the Wii U now. And that's just a testament to just how good the original design for the GameCube was. It was a very underappreciated console, particularly in terms of power. It was actually quite meaty. So I think that the shift towards x86 is definitely going to be a very good positive for PC development. I think it's going to fix a lot of the bugs that we've been having and performance glitches. I don't think it's going to magically make PCs a nirvana where everything is rosy and fine, because that's not games development now. Allow me to illustrate this in just a few sentences. Games development now is becoming huge. These worlds are becoming massive, and making everything run absolutely fine on every single PC configuration out there is not feasible. It is just not. They cannot make sure that a game runs really well on, say, an FX 6300 with an AMD Radeon 7950, and also runs absolutely as well and perfectly on, say, an Intel 2500K with, say, a GeForce 760 graphics card, and it just can't happen. There's going to be occasional bugs in it, not just to mention the fact that, of course, driver revisions and so on, but what I do think is going to happen is that we're going to get much better ports, and I think those ports are going to be much cleaner. I think there's going to be a lot less shortcuts, if you will. Overall, one would also hope that there's going to be less console exclusives. And by console exclusives, I don't mean titles that, for example, Infamous, that have been created by Sony, for example, for their specific console, because that's not realistic. Similarly, you can't expect Sony to create, say, Infamous for the Xbox. But what I do hope is that there are going to be a lot more titles which are released on the PC a lot faster, and we're not going to get the 6-month wait sometimes, or the 2 to 3 month wait that we have to do sometimes just to get the title to PC, which is sometimes annoying. And sure, we do get the superior version often, for example Batman Arkham City, but we just have to wait for it. Maybe I'm just being greedy, but I want that superior version at 1080p at 60 frames per second with slightly higher resolution textures now. Now, one argument and one caveat here, of course, is that for a long time into the future, maybe a couple of years, I think consoles are going to easily be able to put the 60 frames per second at 1080p. I'm not quite sure how long into the future. I guess it depends on how fast they push the games. I also think that games that have heavy use of compute functions are going to translate very strangely to PCs, and I have a feeling that we're going to definitely see a sharp rise in GPU requirements. It's likely going to be a GPU that can better support compute functions such as a higher end NVIDIA card or a higher end AMD card, simply because I think we're going to start using those quite a bit, which is fine. The PCIe bus and so on can easily handle this level of punishment, and as long as you've got a good enough amount of GPU memory, it's not going to be a huge issue, I don't think. As mentioned before, the Xbox One, of course, does use DirectX, and it's going to be using a version of DirectX 11.2, which is going to also be available for Windows 8. Now, this version does come with a few changes and a few additions from, say, the previous version of DirectX. So one of the benefits of this is, as I said, it's going to allow a lot better access to developers for the PC format, but I think as well it's going to also drastically improve the turnaround of games, and hopefully we're going to get much more faithful ports across all the platforms. Obviously there are still going to be specific issues each console or PC versions, because each platform has its own inherent weakness. That's just a given. There are definitely going to be platform specific features, however, that each system is going to have major advantages over, and it's going to be very strange and a very interesting time to see how this develops over a number of years. Regardless, however, I do think that PC gamers are going to be in a very, very good time, and I think we should be very happy that the PlayStation is going to be released. I think that now more than ever, I'm a very happy camper being a PC gamer. However, with all of that said, I'm also, excuse me by the way, I'm also going to be extremely happy that my PlayStation 4 is going to be arriving on launch, because I think it's going to be a very cool system. But I think we're going to get much better quality of games on all systems involved. I think that we're going to also see a time when developers are going to be exploring the specific platform functions of the games, and I think it's going to be very cool for all to see. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.